The rope creaked in the morning wind, a sound that had become as familiar to the townspeople as the church bells or the whistle of the afternoon train. Martha Hayes stood on the wooden platform, her hands bound, her face pale but defiant, watching the sun rise over the dusty main street of Redemption Creek. The noose hung loose around her neck, not yet tightened, as Sheriff Coleman read the charges in his slow, deliberate drawl. She had stolen bread. 3 loaves, to be exact, from the general store. In the harsh winter of 1887, when food was scarce and prices had tripled, such a crime carried weight. The town council had deliberated for all of 20 minutes before passing sentence. Death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn. Martha hadn't spoken a word in her own defense during the trial. She hadn't denied the crime, hadn't wept, hadn't begged for mercy. She had simply stood there with her thin shoulders squared, her worn dress hanging loose on her diminished frame, and accepted the verdict with a nod. The jury had interpreted her silence as arrogance, as the stubbornness of a woman who refused to show proper remorse. They didn't know, couldn't know, about the 3 small faces waiting in the abandoned mining shack on the edge of town, 3 children who had eaten nothing but melted snow for 2 days. The crowd had gathered, as crowds always did for such spectacles. Merchants closed their shops, farmers left their fields, even the saloon girls emerged in the cold morning air, shawls wrapped tight against the bitter wind. Death was entertainment in a place where entertainment was scarce. But there was something different about this hanging, something that sat uneasy in the collective conscience of Redemption Creek. Perhaps it was the crime itself, so small, so desperate. Perhaps it was the accused, a woman whose only sin seemed to be poverty and motherhood. Among the crowd stood James Thornton, though calling him part of the crowd wasn't quite accurate. He stood apart, as he always did, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low, his weathered hands resting on the wooden rail that separated spectators from the platform. James was a widower, had been for 3 years now, ever since fever took his wife Sarah and left him alone on the sprawling ranch that bore his family name. He was known as a fair man, a quiet man, someone who kept to himself but never turned away a neighbor in need. He had watched the trial from the back of the courthouse, had seen Martha Hayes stand silent and alone. He had noticed what others missed, the way her eyes kept darting toward the window, as if calculating the distance to somewhere else, somewhere more important. The way her hand unconsciously moved to her stomach, as if checking for something that was no longer there. The way she flinched when the gavel fell, not from fear of her own fate, but from some deeper, more primal worry. Now, as Sheriff Coleman finished reading the charges and reached for the lever that would open the trapdoor beneath Martha's feet, James Thornton moved. He didn't run, didn't shout. He simply stepped forward with the calm deliberation of a man who had made a decision and saw no reason to doubt it. His boots echoed on the wooden platform as he climbed the steps, and the crowd fell silent, confused by this interruption to their morning's entertainment. The sheriff turned, one hand still on the lever, his face a mixture of annoyance and surprise. James Thornton was not a man to be dismissed lightly. He owned more land than anyone else in the county, employed half the ranch hands within 50 miles, and had the kind of quiet authority that came not from loudness but from absolute certainty. "James," the sheriff said, trying to keep his voice level, "this ain't your concern. Step back down." James didn't step back. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folding knife, its blade catching the morning light. The crowd gasped, uncertain whether they were about to witness a rescue or another crime. Martha Hayes, who had shown no emotion during the trial or sentencing, finally looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time. Without a word, James opened the knife and reached for the rope above Martha's head. The hemp fibers parted under the sharp blade, and the noose fell away, landing in a coiled heap at her feet. The sheriff's hand fell from the lever, and for a long moment, nobody moved. It was as if the entire town had drawn a collective breath and forgotten how to exhale. "This woman stole bread," James said, his voice carrying across the silent square. "She took 3 loaves because her children were starving. I know this because I made it my business to find out. I rode out to that mining shack last night. I saw those 3 little ones, huddled together for warmth, their bellies so empty they couldn't even cry anymore. He turned to face the crowd, his weathered face showing no anger, only a deep, weary sadness. "We're fixing to hang a woman for trying to keep her children alive. We're fixing to make orphans of 3 young souls whose only crime was being born to poverty. And we're calling it justice." Someone in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A woman looked down at her hands. The sheriff cleared his throat but said nothing. James continued, his voice steady and firm. "I'm taking responsibility for this debt. Whatever she owes for that bread, I'll pay triple. Whatever punishment she deserves, well, you can try to hang me instead, though I expect you'll find that considerably more difficult." He turned back to Martha, who still stood frozen on the platform, her hands bound, her eyes wide with an emotion that might have been hope or might have been simple disbelief. With careful movements, James cut the ropes around her wrists, freeing her hands. She brought them up to her throat, touching the place where the noose had rested, as if needing physical proof that it was truly gone. "Come with me," James said quietly, speaking only to her now, the crowd forgotten. "You and your children. I've got a bunkhouse sitting empty, plenty of room. I've got work that needs doing if you're willing. Cooking, mending, helping with the livestock. Nothing that needs more strength than you've got, and nothing that would take you far from your young ones." Martha's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her throat was too tight, her mind too overwhelmed. She had prepared herself for death, had made peace with leaving her children orphaned, had accepted that this was the price of her desperate theft. She hadn't prepared for kindness, for salvation, for this quiet-spoken rancher who had appeared like something from a fever dream. "Why?" she finally managed to whisper, the first word she had spoken in days. James considered the question for a moment, his eyes distant. "My Sarah used to say that the measure of a town, of a people, of a person, wasn't in how they treated the strong and the prosperous. It was in how they treated the desperate and the hungry. She'd be ashamed of what we were about to do here today. I'm ashamed that I almost let it happen." He looked back at the crowd, at the sea of faces that showed embarrassment, anger, confusion, and in some cases, relief. "There's a lot of hard things in this world. Winter is hard. Hunger is hard. Losing the people you love is hard. But none of those things are as hard as losing our humanity, our compassion, our ability to see ourselves in the suffering of others." The sheriff stepped forward, his face red, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. "James, this is against the law. She was convicted, sentenced legal and proper. You can't just—" "Can't I?" James interrupted, and though his voice remained calm, there was steel beneath the quiet words. "Then arrest me, Coleman. Charge me with interfering with an execution. Charge me with cutting down a woman whose only crime was loving her children more than she feared dying. Put me on trial, and we'll see if 12 men in this county are willing to convict me for choosing mercy over law." The sheriff's hand fell away from his gun. He knew, as everyone in that square knew, that such a trial would never result in a conviction. James Thornton was too respected, too essential to the prosperity of Redemption Creek. More than that, too many people in that crowd were already feeling the weight of what they had been about to witness, the shame of their own complicity in such harsh justice. The mayor, who had been standing near the front of the crowd, stepped forward. He was a small man, soft from years behind a desk, but he had been elected on promises of fairness and progress. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we can revisit this matter. The council might be persuaded to commute the sentence, given the circumstances and Mr. Thornton's willingness to make restitution." It was a face-saving measure, a way for the town to step back from the precipice without admitting they had been wrong. James recognized it for what it was and nodded once, accepting the compromise. Martha Hayes, still standing on the platform with her freed hands trembling, looked from the mayor to the sheriff to James, her mind struggling to comprehend that she was not going to die, that her children would not be orphaned, that some impossible mercy had intervened at the last possible moment. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice breaking on the words. I can't." "You can eat first," James said simply, offering his arm to help her down from the platform. That's all that matters right now. Everything else, we'll figure out as we go. As they walked through the crowd, people stepped back, creating a path. Some faces showed approval, others anger at being robbed of their spectacle. Most showed simple confusion, uncertain how to process what they had just witnessed. Martha walked as if in a dream, her legs unsteady after hours of standing in terror, her mind unable to fully grasp her change in fortune. They passed the general store, where old Mr. Henderson stood in the doorway. James stopped and turned to face him. "Send your bill to my ranch. For the bread she took and for whatever she and her children will need for the next month. Flour, bacon, coffee, sugar, everything." Henderson nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. "James," he said quietly, "I wasn't the one who pressed charges. Town council got wind of it somehow, said an example needed to be made. I would have let it go, if anyone had asked." James studied the old merchant for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you, Henderson. But somebody in this town thought 3 loaves of bread were worth more than a human life. Worth remembering that, when we start congratulating ourselves on our mercy." They continued on, leaving the square behind, leaving the whispers and speculation to swirl in their wake. James had left his horse tied near the edge of town, and he helped Martha up into the saddle before mounting behind her. She sat stiffly at first, uncomfortable with the proximity, but as they rode toward her children, toward the abandoned mining shack where 3 small lives waited in terrified uncertainty, she began to relax slightly. "Your wife," Martha said after they had ridden in silence for several minutes. "She must have been a remarkable woman." "She was," James agreed. "She'd have liked you, I think. She always said the strongest people were those who kept going even when everything seemed impossible." When they reached the mining shack, 3 small faces appeared at the broken window, 2 girls and a boy, ranging in age from maybe 4 to 8. Their eyes were huge in their thin faces, their clothes little more than rags. When they saw their mother, alive and free, they burst from the shack with cries of joy and relief, throwing themselves at her with the desperate intensity of those who thought they had lost everything. James stayed on his horse, giving them space for their reunion, watching as Martha knelt in the dirt and gathered her children close, her shoulders finally shaking with the tears she hadn't allowed herself during trial or sentencing or even standing on the gallows. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of overwhelming emotion that had no other outlet. After a few minutes she looked up at him, her face streaked with dust and tears. "We'll work hard," she promised. "You won't regret this." James dismounted and began helping the children gather their meager possessions. "I already don't regret it," he said. "I'd have regretted the alternative for the rest of my life." As they rode together toward Thornton Ranch, the sun climbing higher in the winter sky, Martha Hayes held her youngest child close and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to believe that survival might be possible, that tomorrow might come, that mercy still existed in a world that had seemed determined to crush her beneath its heel. Behind them, Redemption Creek would spend the day arguing about what had happened, about law and justice, and the line between them. But ahead, at the ranch, there was warm food waiting, and shelter, and the simple gift of another day alive.